Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's Dr. Joel Hunter here to teach bioethics. This is a 200-level course at Truckee Meadows Community College, and I'm looking forward to producing videos on each of the chapters that you're reading. And I would like to invite you to make sure that you have checked out the syllabus. I'm going to mention a couple things about that. But mainly what I want to do, since the focus is going to be helping you through the readings, with these videos, I want to be able to today just describe for you how the text is laid out and how I suggest that you use it. Now, I do talk about this in the syllabus, but here's the short version. All right, so we have in our readings 3 parts. The first part consists of the first 2 weeks. It's the first 2 chapters in the text, and it's laying groundwork. It is foundational stuff, principles and theories that you will need to become familiar with. Now, this is a section, it'll go by quickly, and it'll be easy to forget if you don't review. So every now and then, as we move forward through the middle section that has to do with medical ethics, and then the next section which has to do with life and death issues, you will need from time to time to go back to these first 2 chapters to review the theoretical basis for a lot of the arguments that are going to appear, as well as what's going to occur in the readings that are companion to each chapter. Let me say something about that. Once we get into part 2, which concerns the medical profession, medical ethics, we begin to break up the weeks as follows. The first week on a given subject is going to be dedicated to what I call the instructional part of the text. It's the first half, roughly. Usually between 8 to 10 pages of reading that you will do, and then you will be quizzed on that part of the text. Then, to follow up in the next week, you will have a series of readings, typically around 3, that I have selected from the next section attached to that chapter. And so these are case studies. They are published papers that are famous in this field and that are helpful to know and understand, what sort of shapes the ideas behind the issues that we're talking about. So the scholarly stuff is what you'll be engaging in the second week in any given chapter. And then you'll have a quiz on that material as well that will be primarily short answer paragraph type responses. Now, I'm going to give you some assistance with those in advance so that you won't be struggling to formulate a paragraph while you have a limited amount of time with the quiz open. But I'll say more about that as we get to it and put that in an announcement on Canvas. Okay, so that's the way the course is laid out, because pretty much the rest of the period of the time that we'll have in the chapters in part 2 that has to do with medical ethics, and then part 3, which has to do with issues of life and death. It's structured that way. Instructional text first, then the second week is a series of readings. Okay, 80% of your grade is on the quizzes, on your quiz performance. And so it's important for you to prepare those. My purpose in doing these videos is to help you focus on the parts in the readings that are going to help you. Now, the next thing I want to say is the other 20% of your grade is a case study. It's your final project for the course. And I've posted the instructions for doing that. Now, I'm going to spend some time talking about that in a later video. But here's what I want you to know. What I've decided to do is break up that assignment into some chunks that will step you through the process of how you write the case study. So I have an exemplar for you to look at. I'll get that and talk about that at a later time. Then we're going to talk about selecting your topic, and then how to use the discussion feature on Canvas to put your topic out there along with others who share that topic, and to exchange ideas about that. And I have a process for you to go through where you'll be identifying the relevant ethical issues, you'll be deciding the relevant ethical theories, and then doing an analysis, an evaluation of the moral dilemma or moral problem in the case that you've selected. So anyway, that's just really 30,000-foot overview of the assignment. I'll definitely go into more detail later. But just to let you know, that's going to be sort of spread out over the whole semester. I don't want you to get through the text and through the readings and then hit that case study and be like, oh, I got to do this big thing. It's not going to be like that. That would be very hard to do, especially since we have so much reading packed into the course. Okay, so here's what I want to do. I want to go ahead and start off with the first chapter, the first assigned reading, and let's get right to it. I have a slide deck prepared, so let's go check it out. All right, let's get started with chapter 1 of part 1. Part 1 is Principles and Theories, and it only consists of 2 chapters. And in our first chapter, Moral Reasoning and Bioethics, we're going to really look at the landscape of what we're going to be covering in the course. This is sort of background and essential knowledge that you need to have going forward. And then in the second chapter, in part 1, we'll talk about, well, that is where your split first occurs, where you have the instructional part of the text that has to do with the bioethics and moral theories, and then some readings that accompany it. So we'll talk about that next time. But let's move through chapter 1, and I want to touch on a couple of big points. First point I want to make, though, is the structure of the chapter is there to help you, and I can't encourage you enough to make use of what the author has provided in the text. So the way it starts, and the way most of us approach a reading, is we just start at the beginning and we go through to the end. I encourage you not to do that with this text, because the text itself is not easy. Doing philosophy is not easy. What I really encourage you to do is 3 steps. Step 1, I really want you to go to the back of the chapter, where you will find 2 small subsections. Subsection 1 is a vocabulary list. So have a look. Let me just turn to the first one in chapter 1. It's on page 29. So go there and you'll find key terms. Look for that section in each of your readings. You'll want to make sure that you understand each of those key terms, and look in the main part of your reading that occurs before that section, and make sure that you have identified, circled, I believe your author bolds most of these terms, and be sure that you understand them backwards and forwards. Those are really, really essential for your quiz. Then on the second part that I want you to look at is the summary, which occurs right after the key terms. This gives you sort of an outline of the entire chapter, and it will help you, especially if you use the key terms, it will help you identify the parts of the chapter that you'll need to focus on, and the concepts, that you'll need to focus on within that chapter. Now, it will only state a summary version of that. To really understand it, you'll have to go into the chapter and see how that summary statement is unpacked, how it is explained by your author. And so that's step 1. Step 2 in doing the readings, what I encourage you to do is to then go back to the beginning, and in a journal or notebook, start making an outline. And your text has subsections within each chapter. I encourage you to make a topical outline so that you can then fill out with your own paraphrases the important points that occur within each subsection. And that will give you like a spine or a skeleton for your reading, so that you can organize your thoughts and sort of figure out the connections between the different topics that are covered in the chapter. I really encourage you to do that. So step 2 then would be go through the text and make an outline from the subsections. Then lastly, you'll want to chunk your reading. Don't try to do it all in one sitting. Well, I don't like to do that. Maybe you do, but I do not like to do that, especially with dense reading. Instead, take it in chunks. And this is where your outline helps you. It's like pick a couple chunks to do, a couple subsections to do, and read it slowly and thoroughly and looking for those key terms on the vocabulary list and making sure that you understand how it's unpacked. Okay, so that was a preface to now getting into the first chapter, but carry that process over into the other, the rest of your readings, and I think you will be successful, or at least you'll give yourself the best chance for success. Okay, so let's get right to it, and I need to begin the PowerPoint here. Let me see if I can actually start it. Yes, success. Okay, so let's go into just a brief overview of what ethics is. As it says here on the slide, the study of morality, right? Using the tools and methods of philosophy. And if you don't know what philosophy is, philosophy, I like to think of it as getting insight into things that matter. And the philosopher's raw material is concepts, arguments, and judgments. And so that's what we're dealing with when in the reading, and that's what you're dealing with as you process that reading. Concepts, arguments, judgments. That's the raw material, doing philosophy. And really the essential one that you're going to find brought out, highlighted by your author, is arguments. And especially in ethics, it is the arguments for and against certain moral theories and moral positions when we get into applied ethics. That's where we test these theories. So you'll need to understand argument and form. We'll say more about that in this section here. So morality refers to beliefs about right and wrong actions, right? Or about morally good and bad persons, about their character. And now ethics, to distinguish that from morality, is the study of morality. Okay, it's using the tools and methods of philosophy to study morality. Okay, now within the big area of ethics, it's broken down into three areas: value theory, normative ethics, and metaethics. Now your author doesn't say too much about value theory. It's kind of captured within the margins of what he's talking about here, and he does mention it. So for example, when he talks about morally good and bad persons, that's talking about value theory. Okay. Let me see what I want to say. Yeah, so normative ethics, though, is very important for what we're going to be doing in our course. Normative ethics has to do for the search for the justification of moral standards or norms. And there are norms all throughout life. If you look in the syllabus, I have norms for etiquette. I give you like a whole page about, hey, here's what I recommend for communication with me and your other teachers. There's a nice, or not a nice, that's a dumb word. It's not morally required that you follow the suggestion I have there for how to email your instructors, but it provides a good pattern, a good norm for your conduct when it comes to emailing. Now, the moral component of emailing is a different issue, but that's the point, is that norms apply to different areas. So there are legal norms, for example, and legal and moral do not coincide necessarily. There are plenty of things that are legal that may be immoral, and vice versa. You think of how we come to judge certain laws as unjust. Well, we can't really do that if morality is not in the background, if it doesn't have an overarching force when we talk about legality. So we can't make the argument stick, at least, that just because something is legal, that makes it okay, morally speaking. Not necessarily. So they don't coincide, legal norms and moral norms. And there are other kinds of norms as well. Aesthetic norms is one your author talks about. Like, what do you take for what is pleasant to view and experience? Is it, what about beauty? What are the norms for beauty? Those are aesthetic norms. Okay, enough about that. But that is what normative means. And when we're talking about normative ethics, then we're talking about norms for moral conduct, moral behavior, moral choices. Okay? And lastly is metaethics, which is then the study of the meaning and justification of basic moral beliefs. Like, what are good reasons for why we think we know that some moral norm is true or false, or some moral action is good or bad. So we're thinking then about thinking. We're thinking about moral reflection and what our grounds and justification are for making judgments at all. Okay? So metaethics doesn't really enter in too much. We're going to talk about it some in this presentation, because we're going to talk about ethical relativism, which that has something to say about the nature of truth and also about moral knowledge. So that is doing metaethics. But once we get through that, we're probably not going to see it too much, except where you see arguments that use that kind of framework, like the moral relativist, or the cultural relativist, or the moral nihilist, or the moral absolutist. Those different kinds of positions are evaluated within metaethics. Okay, and you'll be able then to identify in the readings that you have what your different authors' positions are. What kind of metaethical stance do they either assume, or do they actually argue for? Okay, that's getting well beyond what we're going to do today. All right, then the other areas that are important here for our course are applied ethics and how bioethics fits into that. So applied ethics is using then the moral norms and the concepts that we look at in normative ethics in the theoretical part. Now we apply the theoretical part in order to resolve moral issues, moral dilemmas, moral problems. Okay, and so that's the challenge. And what we do is we apply then the moral principles, their theories, and the arguments, the analyses of the factual issues. We apply that to try to answer moral questions that everybody has and that people have every day and they confront every day. So whether it's in law, whether it's in business, whether it's in journalism, whether it's certainly in politics, each of those areas has an applied ethics field. Okay, and so if you think of legal ethics, then that's what that's usually talking about. Then is how do we apply the theoretical part of ethics to the legal field, legal practice. Okay. Now, bioethics then is one of those applied ethics fields, and that's our subject. And what we're focusing here is on healthcare, on medical research, medical technology, issues of life and death. And so that is where our course is situated within applied ethics. Okay. Very good. Let's move on then. Now, this is important to understand how to think about norms. Now, I mentioned this already. Different areas have different norms. There's norms of etiquette. There's norms of legality. There's aesthetic norms, and there's moral norms. Now, when we think about moral norms, one of the distinctive features of moral norms is that of all the areas in life that have norms, we usually take moral norms as the most important, that moral norms dominate over the other forms of norms. And I mentioned that already when I was comparing the morality and the legality of given action or given policy or given law. If we deem or we have an intuition or we argue that a certain law is unjust, what that is asserting then, or implying I should say, is that there are moral norms that dominate those particular legal norms. Like take Jim Crow laws. If we argue that Jim Crow laws are unjust, we are also at the same time asserting that moral norms should dominate and do dominate legal norms. That's what this concept means. So have a look at that. It's page 5 in your text. So yeah, moral norms override other kinds of norms. An example your author gives is, so let's say there's aesthetic norms, like we want to clear the public parks of homeless people, right? Because why? Well, because we don't want to look at them. We don't want to have to encounter them. That's an aesthetic norm, okay? And it's enforced then by maybe a civic code, municipal code, or something like that. Now, why should that policy and that activity dominate over, say, the moral norms that have to concern how we treat each other and the value of persons and what public spaces are for, what they mean, morally speaking. Okay, so there's an example of how a moral norm should override an aesthetic norm. Okay? At least we often argue that way, even if we're not aware of that. Okay, next concept is universality. So we want to say then that moral norms have a universal, that is, they apply in the same kinds of situations that, whatever the particular case was. So particular and universal are kind of opposites, right? So moral norms, the argument here is not that moral norms are not particular to a time and a place, even if they are applied that way, but instead, moral norms have this feature of being universal. That, when we talk about justice, for example, what would be true about how we treat a homeless person in San Francisco should be the same as we treat a homeless person in Jakarta, Indonesia, right? It's still a human being. They still have the same moral worth, and there are certain obligations we have as a society to treat our fellow human beings. Those are moral considerations, right? So, yeah, that asserts then that time and place fade in their relevance when we're talking about moral considerations. Okay? So the universality of moral norms is important. Third concept on your list here is impartiality. All right, so what about differences between people, like age or gender or race? Are those morally relevant differences? Or should all human beings, regardless of those kinds of differences, be treated the same? In other words, the norms apply to everyone equally. Now, if you make exceptions to those, to impartiality, then what you have to show is that there is some morally relevant difference between persons. Okay, and of course that's done all the time. And then the argument then becomes, whether or not you have sufficiently defended, justified that moral difference that you were asserting when you're applying a moral norm differently to different people. Okay, so that's what impartiality is about. Now your author gives an example then, about from James Rachel's and how he explains this point. It's really good. It's a quote, block quote there on page 6. Last concept for when we talk about moral norms and the features of moral norms is reasonableness. And this is where common sense enters into our moral reasoning and how we apply moral norms to our moral life. If moral judgments are going to have any weight at all, they've got to be more than just personal taste. They've got to be more than just, an emotional reaction. They've got to be backed up by reasons. And that can include things like factual evidence when you're describing a particular situation. But it also applies to the general moral principles that you think are relevant to resolving a moral question or problem. And so this assumption that, to reach a good moral judgment, a sound moral judgment, means that you're applying the tools of reason to do that. Okay, so we then can move on, I believe, to our next slide and talk about, talk about moral obligations. Moral obligations, then, this is really all part of the reasonableness feature of moral norms. So think of this as a subset of moral reasonableness. So obligations, they concern our duty, what we're obligated to do. If you think of the word ought here is crucial. What ought one to do? What ought one not to do? We're talking then about actions, and we need to look at the moral principles or rules that guide those actions. We need to study the moral theory that purports to explain right actions, make judgments about right or wrong actions. All of that, all of those efforts, as we reason through them, are part of moral obligations. Duty is the concept. Moral values, then, are those things that we think are morally praiseworthy or morally blameworthy. Are they good? Are they bad? So that's how we will describe persons. It's how we'll describe their character. It's how we'll describe their motives. So we attribute moral values to people and to things. But when we're talking about, say, inanimate objects, those may have non-moral value. And so the key idea here is don't confuse things that have non-moral value with things that have moral value. So, like your textbook. Your textbook has non-moral value. It has whatever you paid for it, right? Or maybe it means even more because it's part of something more valuable to you, like an education. So it may not just be a dollar figure value. It may be something else. But as a text, as this inanimate object, it doesn't have moral value. Okay, persons, character, and motives. Those are the things that have moral value. Okay, and so just to summarize then, the difference between obligations and values, when we talk about obligations, we're talking about actions. And those actions are either morally right or wrong. And then we have persons when we're talking about moral values. We're talking then about good and bad, morally speaking. Okay, now let me just check ahead here. Yeah, I'm going to come back for just a second and say something a little more about the right and wrong, which refers to actions. So you'll read and you'll hear me talk about this. There are two levels of morally right and wrong actions. There is when we talk about morally right, there are morally permissible actions, and then there are morally required or morally obligatory actions. So the morally required or obligatory, that's the strongest sense of a morally right action. But there may be certain actions that don't have that force behind them, but instead you would say they are morally permissible. So you may choose to do it and remain and act morally. You may elect not to do it, and that will not affect it does not make it a morally wrong action. If you decline to perform an action that is morally obligatory, then yes, that would be wrong. Okay, so look at that section there on page 8 about the distinction between what's morally permissible and morally obligatory. Okay, and then when we talk about prohibited action, we're talking about ones that are morally wrong. Okay, so obligatory or required and prohibited, those are opposites of each other. Permissible and impermissible, those are opposites of each other. Okay, then there are another class of actions that are called supererogatory, and that simply means going above and beyond what duty requires of you. And so obviously these would be morally right actions, but they go beyond what the norm might prescribe as morally required in a given situation. So you're going beyond what is required. You're doing more than what is required. So you may, for example, it may be your moral duty to your fellow human who is poor may demand of you that you assist them. That's obviously a debatable point. So a supererogatory act would be one where you just give the poor person everything you have. Obviously that's above and beyond what duty would require of you. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say there. Now we want to talk about the moral principles in bioethics in particular. Actually, it's not in particular. They apply to other areas of ethics as well. It's true for all applied ethics. And so what you want to do is make a distinction between absolute principles and prima facie principles. This is discussed on pages 8, on page 8 mainly, and it goes on, and we'll build it out when we talk about some of the moral principles that are relevant to bioethics in particular. We'll look at some of the features of those principles. All right, but for now, what you want to do is note the difference between absolute principles, and another way of saying absolute is exceptionless. That means that a principle will apply in a given situation without exception, no qualifications. A prima facie principle, however, is going to apply in all cases unless an exception is warranted. Okay, so a prima facie principle is non-absolute because it allows for exceptions. But notice that the exceptions have to be warranted. In other words, and here we go back to that concept of reasonableness. There has to be demonstrated that the exception is warranted. Okay, and that's done with reason. Okay, so now let's go to these 5 features of the moral principles, particularly relevant to bioethics. So each of these has been integral to major moral theories, and we'll be looking at some of those soon. They provide evidence that the principles capture something essential in our moral experience. Okay, so the 5 principles here are autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, utility, and justice. Okay, so autonomy is a person's rational capacity to govern themselves, to be self-determining. Okay, so it's your ability to direct your own life and choose for yourself what you will do and what you won't do, what you will avoid, what you will pursue. All of that reflects your autonomy. So, autonomous persons, and here's the principle now, autonomous persons should be allowed to exercise their capacity for self-determination. Okay, we're going to find this as a particularly common principle cited when moral problems are being decided. So yeah, and notice what this presumes. It presumes, first of all, that the persons have intrinsic worth. In other words, your worth as a human being does not apply on something external to you. It is the very fact of your humanity that is of value. That you are human and that you are capable of autonomy is valuable in and of itself. Okay? Intrinsic. So that means issues like respect, treating difficult choices you have to make, and providing you information to help you make those choices is a way that we show respect. So respect is related to autonomy. Okay? How is autonomy violated? Well, when we do things that thwart your ability to choose freely, like when we withhold information, that is something that violates your autonomy, and we want to say that is violating this key moral principle, and therefore it's immoral to do that. Okay, so what autonomy does is it puts these restraints on what can and should be done to our fellow human being. Of course, there are exceptions, but again, those kinds of exceptions have to be warranted and defended with good reasons. Okay, so the next thing, and by the way, particularly in medical ethics, when we get to that, we'll see autonomy as essential to the concept of informed consent. Okay, let's talk about non-maleficence. It's just a fun word to say, non-maleficence. And so the principle here is that we should not cause unnecessary injury or harm to those in our care. Okay. Now the question might be, well, who is in our care? Who am I responsible for, responsible to? That's an interesting question. But in bioethics, you understand this principle, particularly in medicine, where the idea is the doctor should do no harm above all, right? A nurse should do no harm above all. That is expressing this principle of non-maleficence. So codes of conduct, how we behave, institutional regulations, government rules and laws, all of those ways in which the principle is part of our social life, political life, all of those are going to be designed to protect the welfare of persons. In my former life, I was an engineer, and this was hammered into us early on, is that remember that when you're designing a bridge or you're designing an electrical system, the safety of people who are going to be maintaining it or using it, or who just might bump into it, is paramount. And so all that you do in a design then is framed within this moral principle of non-maleficence, where we design things a certain way to ensure public safety. Okay? So this is all over the professions, and the healthcare profession certainly is a big part of it. Okay. Now, does that mean we can't ever cause pain in the performance of our profession? Well, no, it doesn't mean that. But it means that the harm, that if we have to cause harm to someone in our care, it has to be necessary. And it has to be necessary in order to produce a better result, a good result. So it doesn't mean we eliminate all risk. It doesn't mean we eliminate all harm. But if it's unnecessary risk, if it's unnecessary harm, then it's always wrong, according to this principle. Okay, the next principle is very much related to it, and that's the principle of beneficence. And a lot of people would consider this this is like the core thing that morality is about beneficence. And so what this principle says is that we should actively promote the well-being of others and prevent or remove harm to them. Okay, so we have to actively promote the well-being of others. That's what this principle says. So we want to do more than just avoid harming people and inflicting pain and suffering. We want to actively help them. And so obviously the duty of doctors and nurses, that's what they're trying to do when we talk about healing, when we talk about care. We're promoting the patient's good, all right? So that is the principle of beneficence in action. And these have the force of beneficence, has the force of moral obligations. Those professionals are compelled, morally speaking, they're obliged to do that. Okay, so let's see if there's anything else to say about beneficence at this time. It's pretty straightforward. Just remember, it's about advancing the welfare of others. Okay. Next, the principle of utility. So here, this has to do with having to weigh risks and consequences for our actions. And so what this principle says is that we should produce the most favorable balance of good over bad for all concerned. So when we talk about beneficence, then we're saying benefits. And utility applied to beneficence means the benefits of a given action should be greater than, more favorable than the harm that might occur from the same action. Okay, so we're looking then at the results of an action and trying to weigh, to balance the good over the bad. So that's the real world, right? I mean, this is where we can't, in some cases, we can't just do 100% good, where the consequences of an action is not 100% good, that there might be some bad consequences to it, and we can't necessarily avoid that. Sometimes we cannot avoid harm. And so, yeah, when we talk about non-maleficence, for example, we were talking then about sometimes it's justifiable to act in ways where harm is necessary, but only if the overall result is better, and so is good for the patient. So yeah, and this is the real world. Oftentimes we can't do good for someone unless there is something that is either going to hurt or bring some harm. But what we want with the principle of utility is to recognize those two sides to any given action, but then make sure that the balance is toward the good. The overall outcome is trying to maximize the good, minimize the bad or the evil for everybody. Okay. Yeah. Utility, it cannot substitute for the other principles. All right. It's really kind of subsidiary to the other principles, but it works together, for things. It can work, I should say. It can work in support of efforts like justice, the fifth principle. It can work in support of things like autonomy. But if it's allowed to override the other principles, you'll find that utility will often conflict with issues of justice, issues of autonomy, issues of beneficence. And that's where utility gets kind of off the rails, or can get off the rails. Okay, so, a lot of health policies are based on, weighing issues of utility, and we'll be definitely looking at that as the course goes on. All right, justice is the fifth principle. So, what is the principle here? It's, people get what is due to them. People get what's fair. And so we can enter most situations and figure out what justice requires of us and of others, even if we can't really explain what it is. I don't know if there's really any more I want to say about justice. Your author goes into different forms of it: retributive justice, distributive justice. Talks about libertarian theories, about how to weigh personal freedoms against the sort of social obligations that justice often demands of us. Egalitarian theories, which challenge the libertarian principles. So there's a discussion of justice in those terms. It doesn't relate as much to what we're going to be doing in bioethics. It's not central to it, but you'll find it as used as a justification for how a particular moral problem is resolved. So you'll be able to distinguish it when you read, say, an egalitarian theorist who then is working with justice in the sense of equality and overriding fairness when it comes to things like how healthcare is delivered, and what goods and services, minimal, should be provided, things like that. So we'll encounter that. Okay, let's talk now about some metaethics, as I promised you. And ethical relativism is kind of a default position for a lot of people, even though intellectually, as your author will point out, I think kind of gently. I've read some better critiques of ethical relativism, but it does pretty good. But gently, he points out that ethical relativism has some serious problems, and I'll mention those when we get along to it. Even though it's kind of a default position for a lot of people, and you'll find that it's pretty easy to show how inconsistent that typically gets applied. Anyway, so there are different forms that ethical relativism takes, and the two primary ones are subjective relativism. That's the view that right actions are those that are sanctioned by the individual person. The other form that relativism takes is cultural relativism. That's the view that actions are right, or right actions are those that are sanctioned by one's culture. Okay, so in subjective relativism, before I move on to objectivism, I think one of the reasons it's kind of a default position for a lot of, especially Westerners, is that it's very comfortable. It relieves the individual of the obligation to, or maybe not obligation, but the burden of performing critical reasoning in order to work through what ought to be done, what ought not to be done in a given situation, or to answer a particular moral question. So, yeah, this idea that determining right or wrong is just a matter of your own sincerity and integrity about your own beliefs. So, yeah, whatever it is you sincerely believe, well, that's good enough. Now, if you can't see the potential problem with that, you're going to need some work, because I could sincerely believe it's the right thing to do. If I were a German Nazi in the 40s, is to exterminate a whole class of people on the basis of ethnicity. Okay, now how do I argue against that? If some form of moral objectivism isn't true, then it's just a matter of competing subjective relativism. We can't really say that we oppose somebody like that on the basis of moral reasons, then, right? We're saying, well, we're gonna oppose them just because we don't like them. That gets into expressivism. So there are serious problems for the reasonableness of moral theory and those bedrock principles that we take to be important to moral norms, particularly their overridingness, that subjectivism is going to challenge and undermine. Makes it very difficult to have an idea of moral improvement, right? You wouldn't think that somebody who adheres to subjective relativism has any concept of moral improvement, or of moral weakness, for example. There's really no such thing, as long as they're just being sincere. But the only test for that, of course, is internal. It's not something that others can examine. So yeah, that gets to the sort of heart problem here of subjective relativism, is that it implies that every individual, no matter their conduct, no matter their choices, no matter their character, no matter their motives, they're morally infallible. They can literally do no wrong. And that's deeply problematic if you think about that, and what it suggests about our relations with one another then. So it's pretty disturbing if you think about some of the consequences, and your author goes into that. And then the possibility of genuine moral disagreement. There's an argument presented for cultural relativism on page 15. I encourage you to look at that. Let me see if there was anything else I wanted to point out about that. Yeah, one thing I appreciate that your author says on page 15 is that a conflict, when people have conflicting moral beliefs, where there is moral disagreement, that does not necessarily mean that there's a fundamental conflict between the moral norms that we looked at earlier. It doesn't mean there's a conflict at that level. The moral disagreements between individuals and between cultures can arise not just because the moral principles clash, and often they don't, but it has more to do with certain non-moral beliefs that put those principles in a different context, in a different light. And so oftentimes what we take to be some sort of moral conflict is ultimately not a moral conflict on the basis of principle, but on the basis of non-moral facts. And so once you tease that out, then you see that the moral disagreements could be resolved by applying moral reasoning to the problems. Okay? So your author talks about some of those issues, pages 15 through 17. Okay, let me see if there's anything else I want to say about that. I guess not. So moral objectivism then is what opposes this position of ethical relativism, and that is the view that there are moral norms or principles that are valid or true for everyone. Now, this is not absolutism. This is objectivism, and your author does a nice job of explaining the difference between those two things. So the idea there is that we have to take the moral objectivist position, which, by the way, is a controversial position too. What we're doing when we say that or take that position is we're saying that moral norms are mind independent. Okay? In other words, they are not dependent on a subject, a thinking subject. That they apply beyond what any individual mind or even a group mind may hold. So that we can say that, for example, we would be, if moral objectivism is true, then it is possible to criticize certain cultures for their practices. Okay? If moral objectivism is not true, then we would not be able to legitimately criticize other cultures. That could be problematic, as well as I suggested earlier. It also is problematic if we want to be able to say something about moral progress, or I mentioned moral improvement before in the case of the individual, but in the case of a culture or a society, if moral objectivism is true, then we would be able to gauge things like making moral progress as a society, because then we're appealing to something that's not just limited to the norms or principles within that culture or society. We're appealing to something external and broader, maybe even universal, that then by which we can judge and gauge improvement or even regression. Moral objectivism also underlies this idea of the social reformer, somebody who takes a stand that opposes cultural practices that are harmful, morally speaking. And so it almost doesn't make sense to talk about a social reform, true social reform, if moral objectivism is false. Okay. So those are good metaethical issues that are discussed. Page 15 to 17, good stuff. Now I want to jump ahead to the last section of your reading this time, and it's on arguments. I really can't emphasize enough, really, to slowly, patiently go through pages 19 through 29, this last section, because this is really the bedrock. This is your toolkit for doing well in the course. Because, as I mentioned, this is a philosophy course, and so we deal with arguments. And what your author has done is helpfully provided a format for presenting arguments. But sometimes, like when you're doing the readings, you're going to have to learn how to extract the arguments from the text yourself. Okay, so use this section 19 through 29 to learn how to use these tools, the tools of argumentation, and be able then to follow the instructional part of the text where your author helps you identify the arguments, and then applying those that same skill of recognizing arguments into the readings where it isn't necessarily spelled out to you. Some authors do it. Often the philosophers that you'll read will do that, but not necessarily. So you'll need to be able to gain some facility with doing this. So in an argument, what is an argument? It is consists of at least two statements. One statement, at least one statement, is a premise, and that is something that supports a position that the author is arguing for, the position they're trying to establish. That's the conclusion. Okay, so the conclusion is what they want to prove to you, what they want to demonstrate to you, what they're trying to convince you of, for example, and then what, in order to do that, they cite premises, or they provide facts, they give reasons. Those are all kinds of premises put in the forms of statements to support the conclusion. And then the two kinds of arguments that you encounter are deductive arguments, and your author gives you plenty of those examples. And so those are intended to be logically conclusive types of arguments, where if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. Okay, that's a valid argument. If I say that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true, what I'm describing there is a property of deductive arguments called validity. And that gives me some sense that I've structured the argument well. Then if I want to test whether the argument is sound, I need to evaluate whether the premises are in fact true. Okay, that's a separate issue. Then the other type of argument is inductive argument. And inductive arguments are designed to give probable support for their conclusions. So they're not, inductive arguments are never, can never be decisive, and are not intended to be decisive. They only establish that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is likely to be true. Okay? So look on pages especially 20 where this is introduced. Okay, when you are evaluating arguments, your job is to read closely and identify the different types of statements, and your author talks about those starting on page 21. So you want to look at the kinds of statements that you encounter, like conditional statements, if-then statements are very common. Dichotomies, either-or statements are very common, and premises. Universal statements like all x are y, or no x are y, those are universal statements. Then there are particular statements like some x are y, or some x are not y. Those are the different forms that statements will take. And so you want to be able to recognize those even when they're not stated explicitly in that form. Okay, is that a universal statement they're making? Is that a particular statement they're making? Is it an either or? Is it a both and? Is it a conditional statement, and if then? Those are the most common types of statements that you run into. So you want to look at a particular passage that the author is laying out in a text, where they're trying to establish their argument, their thesis, and try to identify those kinds of statements. Okay, so that's the first step. Second step is then you want to find what is the actual position they're taking. What do they want to persuade you of? What do they want to convince you is true? What statement does it seem that the author is aware that they have to support it in order for it to be true? That's the conclusion. And oftentimes there are indicator words that will help you identify that, like therefore or in conclusion, but not necessarily. So you have to be able to identify the position, the claim that they're making and that they're trying to prove to you. And then there is the evidence for the claim. Those are the premises, and that's what you want to identify last. All right, so that's how you go about evaluating arguments. And then starting page 23, well, really 22, there are presented to you some common argument forms. Modus ponens and modus tollens are two of those. So you can look at that. There's a nice box there on page 23. And then each of those has invalid forms as well, so be aware of those. Let's see if there's anything else that I want to say about the forms. I guess the other thing is, and I don't have a slide for it, is on pages 24 through 25, your author goes over 5 or 6 very common informal fallacies. So you'll want to look at those because in moral reasoning in particular, you'll find lots of bad arguments. And so have a look at those common informal fallacies that occur. These are fallacies not of the structure of the argument, like modus ponens and modus tollens, but of the content of the argument, of the claims made. So you've heard of some of these: begging the question, slippery slope, straw man, red herring, ad hominem, things like that. So go through those, and he's got examples for each of them. So have a look at those. Again, that's pages 24 to 25. Okay, now let's talk specifically then about moral arguments, because obviously arguments, not all arguments are moral arguments. So you realize then that the conclusion has to be a moral statement. So it might have something to do with an argument for what we might be obligated to do in a particular case. Maybe it might be an argument for what is prohibited in certain situations. Maybe it's an argument for what is morally permissible. But whatever it is, it's making some moral statement about what one ought to do, what one ought not to do, about what is good in terms of motive or character, or bad in terms of motive or character. So if I'm making, if I'm trying to prove to you that what would be a quick example, that prudence is, let's say I make a statement that prudence is rarely a good motive for action. I'm making a moral statement there. Okay. Then we have to look at moral arguments in general, that they have also moral premises. They're going to have at least one moral premise. Usually it's some general moral principle, like, say, the golden rule or something like that. And then it's going to also have to have some non-moral premise. So it's going to be something that says about some fact or set of facts, some states of affair about the world or about a person. So those would be non-moral premises, together with then a moral premise, which is usually a general moral principle. Okay, what about those premises, though, that are going to be used to support the moral claim in the conclusion? Okay, so they can be supported by, well, other moral principles. Maybe the golden rule, for example, is do as you would be done by, and so behind that or underneath that is maybe a principle of beneficence, right? So that supports, beneficence supports then the moral principle of the golden rule. They can be supported by moral theories, like, say, consequentialism or deontological theory, or social contract theory. They can be supported by other considered moral judgments, that have been arrived at independently, or preceding the particular premise that is trying to be supported. Okay, so some other moral judgment that's taken to be true or correct. Now, moral premises can be criticized through counterexamples, and you'll find then your author doing a nice treatment of this on, let's see, is it page? Yeah, it's the section called Evaluating Premises, and it's pages really 26 through the end, but mainly 26 through 28. And this is a very, 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 very important part of what you're going to be doing as you evaluate the arguments in the readings that I've assigned that go with the instructional part of the text. Okay, and we have reached the end, as you can see by the blank screen. All right, well, thanks for sticking with Chapter 1 here, and you will get another video on Chapter 2 forthcoming. So good luck on your quiz for Chapter 1, and I'll see you next time.